Good afternoon, everyone. And my name's Graham Budd. I am the director here at the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion. I wanted to just give you all a very warm welcome today to what is our first seminar of the term. And I'm delighted today to be able to welcome Chris Oldfield as our speaker. So Chris is a research associate at the Faraday Institute, and he works on foundational issues in the logic of scientific metaphysics, with a special interest in the interpretations of physicalism. And Chris is going to be speaking today on the topic of naturalism without content, where Plantinga's conflict actually lies.
Okay, hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully this will work. Okay, so I hope you can all see that. My name's Chris Oldfield. This is a great pleasure to be with you and to be presenting some thoughts which are a work in progress, but are quite close to my heart, I suppose. This is a paper that is called Naturalism Without Content, where Plantinga's conflict actually lies. And here's just a direction of where we're going. I'm going to introduce the main claim of the paper, and then I'm going to go into the argument of Plantinga's 2011 book, Where the Conflict Really Lies. I'm going to introduce what he considers naturalism to be. He called it a thought. Oh dear. So maybe I'll just introduce it. In his 2011 book, Where the Conflict Really Lies, Science, Religion and Naturalism, Alvin Plantinga presented an argument under the heading of Chapter 10 in Part 4 of that book, which was called Deep Conflict. And the argument is called the Evolutionary Argument Against Naturalism. And under that heading, he presented an argument in support of his overall claim that there is a deep conflict between science and one of the most important claims of between naturalism, that should read, and one of the most important claims of current science. And my concern in this paper is to show why Plantinga's argument for the claim of Part 4, deep conflict, was misleading, not only with respect to the aims and claims of, quote, current science, but I think more profoundly with the aims, with respect to the nature and content of a thing called naturalism. Now, for the sake of argument, notoriously towards the end of his so-called evolutionary argument against naturalism, Plantinga has long taken naturalism to be a negative thought about what there isn't. In fact, he takes it to be a very complex conjunction of negative existential thoughts and beliefs about what there isn't. There isn't a God and there isn't anything like God. So here's Plantinga's summary. I take naturalism to be the thought that there is no such person as God or anything like God. Naturalism, he says, is stronger than atheism. Now, the cardinal difficulty, and for those who know the history of this field, I use that word advisedly, or so I'm going to argue, is that no one has ever been a naturalist in Plantinga's negative sense. No one is a naturalist in that sense. No one has been a naturalist. No one ever can be a naturalist in that sense, because there can be no such thing. There is no thought as naturalism or anything like naturalism as Plantinga conceives the thought. And here's why, as Plantinga himself explains. After all, everything resembles God in some respect. And this cardinal difficulty, I'm going to argue, turns out to be a feature, not a bug that could be fixed, of Plantinga's positive ways of thinking about the existence of God, among other things. Now, the mere possibility of naturalism is going to be occluded by his actualist way of thinking about, quote, negative existentials as such. I'll explain what that is. A negative existential is a technical term for a belief about what doesn't exist, right, what there isn't. And Plantinga, in his book, The Nature of Necessity in 1974, very seminal book, outlined a way of thinking about claims about what there isn't. And under the heading of Section 3 of Chapter 7 on what there isn't, how should we take the semantics, Plantinga gave us an account of how to make sense of claims about what there isn't. which I'm going to say is going to make it impossible to give any meaning to naturalism as Plantinga construes it. Okay, the negative existential thoughts and beliefs which Plantinga ascribes to his real or imaginary naturalist interlocutors purely for the sake of his argument must lack content to begin with. And I'm going to conclude that this is where Plantinga's conflict actually lies. I'm trying to shake people out of entertaining the thought that Plantinga has generated, that there's this thing called naturalism, and it's a kind of boogeyman, that we shouldn't believe it. I am actually going to be quite profound on this. I'm going to say there is no such thing as naturalism in Plantinga's sense. And those who pretend to own the negative thought that Plantinga ascribes to naturalists, of those few philosophers who do pretend to own that thought, I'm going to say we should conclude with St. Augustine's, regretfully perhaps, that though loquacious in their verbosity, they have nothing to say. So here's just an outline of the paper. In section 2, I'm going to distinguish what I call Plantinga's positive ways of thinking about, quote, science and theistic religion from his negative ways of thinking about, quote, science and naturalism. In section 3, I'm going to identify Plantinga's negative thought, naturalism, the negative existential thoughts and beliefs which Plantinga ascribes to his real or imaginary naturalist interlocutors. In the next section, I'm going to look at materialism as a false positive concept that Plantinga tries to add to the naturalist thought to give it some content. And I'm going to show why Plantinga is taking naturalism to include materialism with respect to objects or events or human beings is just irrelevant to Plantinga's argument. It's neither necessary nor sufficient to generate the sense of deep conflict. Then I'm going to really analyze the negative existential belief that naturalism is supposed to represent. And I'm going to compare Plantinga's 1983 construal of his positive belief in God with his construal of a negative belief that there isn't a God, to show what's lacking in Plantinga's recent construal of naturalism. And what's lacking is content. There's just no content to the position. Finally, I'm going to just briefly explain Plantinga's actualist semantics to show why the negative existential beliefs Plantinga ascribes to naturalists that just happen to lack content. They must lack content. Very roughly, it's because God's supposed to be a necessary being, right, in Plantinga's mind. And finally, I'm going to show why this matters for his argument, right? So Plantinga's dialectical stance against naturalism is going to be problematic if naturalism lacks content to begin with. So I hope that's not too quick. Let's get into it, Plantinga's overall claim. Let's begin by recalling what he calls the overall claim. Also, it's a very complex claim in his book, Where the Conflict Really Lies. My overall claim in this book, he says, is that there is superficial conflict, but deep concord between science and theistic religion, whatever those things are. But there is superficial concord and deep conflict between science and naturalism. Now, I am not in this paper going to question the value of Plantinga's positive ways of thinking about science and theistic religion, or science and theistic belief. He thinks those are two words for the same thing. But I am going to question the value of his negative ways of thinking about science and naturalism, right? So however many false positive claims there may be of conflict or concord among science and theistic religion, as bringing believers in both into areas of conflict or concord or whatever, I'm not going to question the value of those positive ways of thinking. I think that he's got a lot to say there. And I'm just, in a way, going to assume his positive ways of thinking about those things. But I do intend to question the value of his negative ways of thinking, to the effect that his argument against naturalism was misleading. Indeed, to quote J.L. Austin, I must confess, I don't really think it's wrong at all. Still, it can at least be misleading. And my reason is going to be that naturalism lacks content to begin with. And for that reason, we need not waste time arbitrating between various conflict theses, however many conflicts there are, however deep or superficial that these conflicts are supposed to be between the false positive claims of science and naturalism. I take it that nothing was ever intended to hang on the use of definite or indefinite articles here. As soon as you've got a claim that there's a thing called science and there's another thing called naturalism, and we need to believe both of these things, I'm going to say that's going to be a problem, because there is no such thing as naturalism. So Plantinga's argument for the claim of deep conflict was predicated on the form of a complex conjunction. It's a complex conjunction of an epistemically acceptable claim E with the content N of a metaphysical belief that he ascribes to naturalists that's not entailed by E. Now, that's quite a mouthful. He says we can abbreviate it as follows. Here's the first premise. He calls it Darwin's doubt, although whether Darwin ever thought anything like this is another question. It's quite a mouthful. We'll abbreviate the first premise as this. This is the first premise of his argument. P of R given N and E is low. Now he explains R is a proposition. R is the proposition that our cognitive faculties are reliable. N is naturalism, and E is the proposition that we and our cognitive faculties have come to be in the way proposed by the contemporary scientific theory of evolution. And P of blank given blank is a kind of technical shorthand for the probability of blank given blank. Now, having mentioned R, let me just add briefly that the existence, functional reliability of a cognitive faculty for producing metaphysical beliefs is not at issue here. However we may or may not come to grasp or believe or accept or endorse and rejoice in such things is irrelevant. It's not my concern. For example, whether it is by virtue of the activity of the Holy Spirit, as Plantinga says, or by virtue of some less godly but no less mysterious complex combination of psychological processes and cognitive mechanisms that we come to have metaphysical beliefs, is just not my concern here, right? In his 1993 book, Warrant and Proper Function, which is one of the first places he outlined this argument, Plantinga presented the issue then as the probability of R given N and E and C, where C is a complex proposition whose precise formulation is both difficult and unnecessary, he said, but which states which cognitive faculties we actually have. Now, whatever sense might eventually be made of the reference to our cognitive faculties in R and E, we may ignore the additional complexity of C just for the sake of simplicity and showing what's lacking in Plantinga's argument against naturalism. My concern is that N lacks content irrespective of R or E or C. Okay. Let me just briefly say about E. My concern in this paper is to show why N lacks content. Did you notice it? It just says it's just a word. N is naturalism. My concern is to show why N lacks content irrespective of E. However, readers informed by current trends in developmentally, cognitively, or culturally extended theories of evolutionary biology or psychology may also question the value of E. I just put Tim Lewin's book here in Cambridge, Cultural Evolution, or we might think of Cecilia Hayes' wonderful book on the cultural evolution of thinking, or the extended evolutionary synthesis in biology. All these discussions, right? There's no such thing as the scientific theory of evolution. We talk about evolution of stars, of thinking, of all sorts of different things, and there's loads of different theories. I'm not going to question, for the sake of this paper, that we can give some content to E. Now, it's crucial for Plantinga's argument against naturalism and for Dennett and Plantinga's 2011 dialectical stance that it's not the case that E implies N, right? Even if it were true that as a theoretical goal, naturalism were tacitly assumed in all reputable courts of law and throughout scientific investigation, as Dennett says it is, Dennett still agrees with Plantinga's main contention that naturalism is not part and parcel of the theory of evolution. So his Plantinga, the way he puts it, on the one hand, there's the scientific theory, and on the other, the metaphysical add-on, according to which the process is unguided. Now, I'm just going to leave it completely open what that process is, just for the sake of explaining what his issue is. So here's his misleading assertion. Plantinga says, he explains in part 4 of his book under chapter 10 what his argument is. He says it like this: I'm going to argue that there is a deep and irremediable conflict between naturalism and evolution, and hence between naturalism and science. My quarrel is not, certainly not, with the scientific theory of evolution, whatever that is. Nor is it an argument for the conclusion that unguided evolution could not produce creatures with reliable belief-forming faculties. I very much doubt that it could, he says, but the fact that it couldn't is neither a premise nor a conclusion of my argument. Right? Still further, my argument will not be for the conclusion that naturalism's false, although of course I believe that it is. That's misleading. What he says is, he will argue, is that naturalism is in conflict with evolution, a main pillar of contemporary science. And the conflict in question is not that they can't both be true. I agree with that. The conflict is not that there is a contradiction between them. I also agree with that. It's rather that one can't sensibly accept them both. I agree. In the same way, I mean to argue that one can't sensibly believe both naturalism and the scientific theory of evolution. I also agree. But here's where Plantinga and I disagree. Plantinga says, if my argument is cogent, it follows that there is a deep and serious conflict between naturalism and evolution. I disagree with that. And hence, a deep and serious conflict between naturalism and science. Now, my quarrel is not with any scientific theory of guided or unguided evolution, although I believe that many philosophers and theoreticians and theories are misguided on what the true theory of evolution is. Nor is it an argument that naturalism, N, is either true or false, because I believe that it is neither. My quarrel is with Plantinga's prior assumption of naturalism's falsity. Of course, I believe that it is false. My quarrel is also with his misleading supposition of what's supposed to follow from his argument, namely, that there is a deep conflict between naturalism and science. Now, if I'm right, we may follow Plantinga's argument from beginning to end, from the first premise to the conclusion, without recognizing what Anscombe called the depth of the problem. What is believed to be false or supposed to be unacceptable if naturalism lacks content to begin with? So it brings us to what naturalism is. And just briefly, here's a mistaken supposition. He just supposes that, of course, naturalism is a metaphysical belief. Now, many philosophers have denied that naturalism is a metaphysical belief, and they have argued, moreover, that to identify naturalism with the propositional contents of a metaphysical belief is to participate in a metaphilosophical error. I'm one of those philosophers. There are also philosophers who would deny that current science is or ought to be believed, and would argue, moreover, that to identify scientific theory with the intentional object of a simple belief is to participate in a kind of meta-scientific error. Right? I'm also with these guys, right? Van Fraassen and so on. But for the sake of charity, I want to endeavour to use the term naturalism only as Plantinga intended in his 2011 book, to speak of the thoughts or the contents of some metaphysical beliefs, not his own. At one point he says, the view I espouse is a radical naturalism, but which he ascribes to some real or imaginary others for the sake of arguing. Now, as a reductio ad absurdum of Plantinga's way of thinking, I hope to show why the complex conjunction N and E, naturalism and evolution is how he thinks of it, does not express a combination of beliefs. If a little thought is given to science, I grant that there is a little thought given to science in Plantinga's work. I'm going to argue that absolutely none is given to naturalism. No thought can be given to naturalism as soon as a little thought is given to science. So for my purposes, you just need to take any belief you want, any positive belief that you have, for example, that there are cows, that will suffice to be an epistemically acceptable claim E, which will be a problem for Plantinga's naturalism having content. Okay, so for the sake of argument, this is how Plantinga construes naturalism. I take naturalism to be the thought that there is no such person as God or anything like God. Naturalism, he says, is stronger than atheism. I think he says in his words, you can rise to the full heights or sink to the lowest depths you can be an atheist without being a naturalist, but you can't be a naturalist without being an atheist, is how he puts it. Now, the thing I want you to notice here is that he takes naturalism to be a negative belief about what there isn't. There isn't a God, and there isn't anything like God. Now, whatever God's supposed to be, whatever it is to be like God in some respect, that's a very strong claim. It's a claim about what there isn't. Others may not follow Plantinga's negative way of thinking about naturalism. right? I'm going to show you that Armstrong didn't think of naturalism in this negative way. Lewis didn't, Dennett didn't, Plantinga didn't, Quine didn't. Dennett didn't in 1996, Maddie didn't, Ladyman and Ross didn't. None of these guys take naturalism to be a claim about what there isn't. If you want some documentary evidence, here's Armstrong. Naturalism I define as the doctrine that reality, whatever that is, consists of nothing but a single all-embracing spatiotemporal system. At the very least, that's a claim about what there is, or at least what reality consists of, whatever reality is. One more example of the same sort of distinction, here's Lewis. Let naturalism be the thesis that whether one's conduct is right supervenes on natural facts. Here's Daniel Dennett, the only mention of the word naturalism in his book Consciousness Explained. The present discussion, he says, is meant to forestall one of the tempting mistakes of armchair naturalism, the assumption that whatever nature makes is a natural kind. None of those is the claim that there isn't a God or anything like God. Is Willard Quine, probably the most famous naturalist of the 20th century, in identifying the philosophical position that I call naturalism, he says, I'm just describing my own position without prejudice to other uses of the term. In fact, he says demarcation is not his aim. If he saw indirect explanatory benefit in postulating a God, he would grant that scientific status too. It's no part of his naturalism that there isn't a God. Here's Penelope Maddie. Is naturalism a scientific thesis? I think the right answer, she says, is that naturalism is not a thesis at all. It's an approach. You might know Mike Ray wrote a book in 2002 on World Without Design, and he said that naturalism wasn't a thesis, like Plantinga said, let alone a kind of atheism plus. It was a research program. And Ladyman and Ross in their book Metaphysics Naturalized say we agree with Mike Ray, right? The concept of our naturalism is given by the principle of naturalistic closure, which is about bona fide scientific institutions, if you're interested. And the PNC is a claim about how to do metaphysics. It's not a claim about what there is, let alone what there isn't. So if we were tracing a historical genealogy, we might begin to wonder against who Plantinga was actually arguing. When setting up the issue in his Warrant and Proper Function book, Plantinga was almost nonchalant in his explanation. The issue then is the value of a certain conditional probability, P of R given N and E and C. Here, N is metaphysical naturalism. Now, it isn't easy to say precisely what naturalism is, he says, but perhaps that isn't necessary in this context. I've got some examples, say David Armstrong, we've already seen that's not right. The later Darwin, that's certainly not right. Quine, not right. Bertrand Russell, when he was asked if he was an atheist, he said, of course not. Crucial to metaphysical naturalism, of course, Plantinga says, is the view that there is no such person as God, as the God of traditional theism. Now, let me just cut to the chase. We could go through historically these views, these fellows' views, these dead fellows' views, with respect to God or the God of traditional theism or various great gods in boots. But it's all irrelevant to Plantinga's argument, because as Plantinga says, the probability we're thinking of is objective probability and not subjective probability, and also not epistemic probability. With respect to Plantinga's argument against naturalism, these dead fellows' historical views or exclamations of belief or disbelief in the great God in boots or the God of traditional theism is completely irrelevant to the issue. Remember, for Plantinga, the issue is the value of a certain conditional probability. And in the context of conditional probabilities, the probability of R given N and E can have no value if no value is given for N or for N and E. In the context of any argument against the complex conjunction of beliefs N and E, N must be given some determinable, if not fully determinate, content. If it can't be, we can say what N isn't. It isn't the content of a belief. Note what I'm saying here. I'm saying that the probability of R given N and E can have no value at all. Not any vague value, not one high or low value, not some range of possible values, and certainly not zero value. In fact, if N were false, if naturalism was false, and the probability of naturalism was zero, then we should note that Plantinga's argument would not work because the premise would be false. P of R given N and E would not be low. Here's a proof of that fact. Suppose for reductio that P of N equals zero. Then the P of N and E, which is defined as the probability of N times the probability of E, would equal zero, which is not greater than zero. And by Kolmogorov's axiom, if you want to get into it, the conditional probability function is only defined for probabilities where the denominator is greater than zero. This matters, folks. However, the conditional probability P of R given N and E in question is intended to be understood, whether it's as a measure of objective chance, as Plantinga intends, or subjective credence, as he suggested in 1993, or epistemic probability. If the issue is the value of P of R given N and E, it has no value if N lacks content, and it has no value if N has false content. Now, it is quite remarkable to me how many negative thoughts Plantinga ascribes to his real or imaginary naturalist interlocutors, both here and elsewhere. In another 2011 essay called Content and Natural Selection, Plantinga adds a third disjunct. He says there, say that metaphysical naturalism, call it N, is the idea roughly that there is no such person as God or anything at all like God, or if there is, this being plays no causal role in the world's transactions. Now that is a very complex negative claim. It sounds positive, but it's actually much more negative and much more complicated. Now, Plantinga's third disjunct about causal influence may be necessary to exclude the thoughts and beliefs of a naturalist who, like David Lewis, thinks that many gods exist and realize causal roles in infinitely many possible worlds, even if you can't feel their causal influence. Now, the fact that arguably the preeminent philosophical naturalist of his generation, of Plantinga's generation, positively rejected every single one of the negative thoughts Plantinga ascribed to his interlocutors and called it naturalism, may diminish the effectiveness of Plantinga's argument against actual particular naturalists. But recall, if at his Lewis say, I might be heard to say there's only one world or that there is no God. But when I say such things, I'm restricting my quantifiers, just as when I look in the fridge and say there's no beer. I'm not saying there's no such thing as beer. Of course there is. I'm not denying there's beer outside the fridge. I'm just ignoring it in my speech. Likewise, he says I may ignore the other worlds and gods without at all denying that they do exist. Now, we could go into that, but in his 2011 book, he says the version that he's presented there, which came after the 2011 A paper, is the official and final version. So I'm just going to ignore that complication and deal with this simplified version, which appears here. My concern, recall, is to show why Plantinga's overall claim actually lies. Whatever else may be intended by naturalism, whatever other philosophers might mean by naturalism, even in Plantinga himself in the context of other versions of his argument, is irrelevant to my concern. Plantinga excluded that third way of attributing negative content to the naturalist thought in his official and final version of his argument, and so I'm going to exclude it too. Now, in this next section, I'm just going to show you why Plantinga's addition of materialism to taking naturalism to include materialism with respect to human beings adds nothing to his argument and is irrelevant anyway. So in the course of his argument, Plantinga did include some additionally positive content to his already complex conjunction of negative thoughts, presumably to motivate acceptance of the reasoning involved in his first premise. Now, I'm going to show why none of these attempts are necessary or sufficient to generate the conflict. So he says this, taking naturalism to include materialism with respect to human beings, I argue that it's improbable, given naturalism and evolution, that our faculties, cognitive faculties, are reliable. In other words, P of R given N and E, including materialism, is low. Now, it's not clear to me what taking naturalism to include materialism with respect to human beings adds to the argument, because materialism with respect to human beings is neither necessary nor sufficient for the claims of deep conflict. To see why nothing in the argument for deep conflict turns on naturalism, including reductive or non-reductive materialism, just have a look at the form of the complex conjunction in the dialectic. He says at the end of his explanation of the premise, the probability of R given N and E and non-reductive materialism is low, and we can deal more briefly with the alternative, P of R given N and E and reductive materialism is low. And in other words, none of this is relevant to his argument against N and E. What's really lacking is that I'm taking issue with is that N lacks content. Now, from my perspective, of course, N lacks content. Naturalism lacks content to begin with. So it's not surprising to me that Plantinga had to include some additionally positive content to motivate the thought expressed in his premise. But it's not clear why Plantinga takes naturalism to include materialism. In fact, it appears to be a product of an exercise in mind reading, an attempt to interpret the thoughts of his interlocutors. Why does he do it? Well, first he says, well, we must note nearly all naturalists are also materialists with respect to human beings. I don't know where he's got this data from, but they hold that human beings are material objects. From this perspective, he says a human person is not, contrary to Descartes and Augustine, an immaterial substance or self that's connected with or joined with, or has a material body. And he just thinks nearly all naturalists would agree on this point. And I've got to say, no, they don't, right? For the sake of argument, Plantinga just appears uncharitably to ignore a range of eliminativist and revisionary and substance dualist positions which remain open to naturalists, even naturalist materialists about human beings. Nearly all naturalists might think that, but some don't. And in the course of his argument, Plantinga unfortunately conflates a range of eliminativist stances towards content as the stuff of intentional explanation, sort of thing you get in Daniel Dennett, with revisionary monistic constructions of beliefs as neural events, the sort of thing you might associate with Donald Davison. He slips between these. And I think this is a problem. So he says, given materialism, beliefs are ordinarily long-standing neural events. As such, they have neurophysiological properties, but also content properties. And the question will be, how are the neurophysiological properties of a neural event supposed to be related to the content that they carry? Each belief will have the property of having such and such a proposition as its content. Now, if it really were a consequence of materialism, or even materialism with respect to human beings, that beliefs are neural events, then those majority of philosophers, I would say, who, irrespective of their status as naturalists or materialists, just reject or have no confidence in the consequent, should give no credence to the antecedent materialism. But of course, it isn't a consequence of naturalism or materialism, or even materialism with respect to human beings, that beliefs are neural events, even if many materialists have given credence to that conditionally conceivable hypothesis. Materialists are free to deny that neural events, and many have done on grounds of externalism about the content or vehicle of mental representations, or richer descriptive accounts of embodied cognition. Now, Plantinga is well aware of this stuff. It's called wide content in the literature. And in a footnote, he just says, look, I'm ignoring all this stuff about externalism. Beliefs aren't in the head. That's the thought. And the content isn't in the head. He says, I'm just ignoring that because nothing in my argument hinges on this omission. And he's right. Nothing in his argument hinges on materialism at all. So recall, my argument is not to evaluate the effectiveness of Plantinga's argument against materialists, or any other of his arguments against materialism. I'm trying to show what's wrong, or what's lacking, or what's misleading about his argument against naturalism. And here's the difficulty. Naturalism lacks content. Now, Plantinga says that it may not be completely easy to see or to say precisely what naturalism is, but so goes the thought, it does exclude some things like immaterial selves or souls. According to naturalism, he says there isn't anything like God, but just how much similarity to God is tolerable from a naturalistic perspective. He talks about Plato's idea of the good and Aristotle's idea of unmoved movers. But Plantinga says, after all, everything resembles God in some respect. That's the cardinal difficulty. However how much similarity to God can a decently sensitive naturalist manage to accept? Look, he says, far be it from me as an outsider to intrude upon a family dispute among naturalists. I'm leaving it to naturalists to settle this issue for themselves. And then the problem is that he's quite right to say that there's a vagueness in the concept of naturalism. But he's quite wrong to say this is for other people to sort out, because the concept of naturalism that's vague here is his concept. And I'm going to say the cardinal difficulty with Plantinga's negative way of thinking is not so goes the thought that naturalism includes some false positive claims of materialism, or that naturalism excludes things of some immaterial kind, but that naturalism excludes everything. After all, everything is like God in some respect. And recall, naturalism is supposed to be the claim there's nothing like God. Naturalism excludes everything and may potentially include nothing at all. So Plantinga was quite right to say this difficulty arises because of the vagueness of the concept of naturalism, but quite wrong to pass this off as a problem for others, because the concept was his concept. For those who've read Kit Fine, the vagueness here is deficiency of content, not deficiency of meaning. There might be other concepts of naturalism which are vague in other ways, right? But Plantinga's concept is vague because of the way he set it up. Now, to see how he sets it up, I want you to compare it with his positive view of belief in God. Now, in his seminal 1983 essay, Reason and Belief in God, under the heading, How Shall We Construe Theistic Belief?, Plantinga outlined his basically positive way of thinking about the existence of God, among other things, right? He does believe that God exists. But he says this question: what is it to believe or assert that God exists? Just which belief is it, into the rational acceptability of which I propose to inquire? Well, he says, it is to answer at the most basic level the ontological question, what is there? To believe or assert that God exists is to believe or assert that there does exist a being of a certain very special sort. Now, the same cannot be said of naturalism. That's my claim. What is it? How should we construe naturalistic belief? What is it to believe or assert that there isn't a God, that there isn't anything like God? What belief is it, into the rational acceptability or unacceptability of which Plantinga proposed to argue? It isn't to answer the ontological question, what is there? It's to answer the question, what isn't there? To believe or assert that there isn't a God or anything like God is to believe or assert that there isn't a being of any special sort. Now, if I ever thought that there was only one question which deserved to be called the ontological question, and I took that question to be Quine's question, what is there? Then I might be tempted to call the question, what isn't there, the negative ontological question. Now, whatever others may have said, the ontological problem, which Quine famously saw could be applied to many ontological questions, was that the question, what is there, needed to be reformed or reformulated, right? Reformed philosophy for disputes to be reconciled, disagreements to be made clear. Quine said in his essay on what there is, look, we look to bound variables in connection with ontology, not to know what there is, but to know what someone's saying there is, to know what a given remark or doctrine, ours or someone else's, says there is. And this much is quite properly a problem involving language, but what there is a totally different question. Amen to that, Quine. Now, I'm going to say that the negative existential thought N, there is no such person as God or anything like God, expresses a complex conjunction of negative thoughts N1 and N2. There is no such person as God, and there is not anything like God. Each of these negative existential thoughts expresses a potentially infinite negation of positively predicative singular existential thoughts of the form. For any x, it's not the case that fx or gx, which we may formalize as follows. His naturalism, the atheistic part is that it's not the case that there is something and that thing has got the attributes of divinity. It's not the case that there is a God. Here's the second part. It's not the case that there is something which has one of the attributes of God. I'm using the monadic predicate letter G to express the complex conjunction of divine attributes, and the monadic predicate letter F to express one of the attributes of God. And naturalism is the conjunction of those things. That it's not the case that something is God or that something is like God in some respect. Now, I'm using the letter G to express, if you like, some or all of the attributes of a God, whatever a God is supposed to be, I don't know in advance. And I'm using the letter F to just express one of the attributes of God. Now, Plantinga's way of thinking, N stands for naturalism, N1 for atheism, and N2 makes naturalism stronger than atheism. Now, conceivably, N1 implies N2, right? If there is only one attribute of God, if all the attributes of God are somehow one attribute, there is only one divine attribute, then N1 collapses into N2. And if you're familiar with puzzles about divine simplicity, you may note that we've not made any of the controversial assumptions here. Defenders of the doctrine of divine simplicity may even wish to affirm the idea that to be F is to be G, that what it is to be one of the attributes of God is to be all the attributes of God. But Plantinga, thankfully, is not a defender of the doctrine of divine simplicity. I'd say thankfully for our purposes. Plantinga says it's extremely difficult to grasp what construe what the doctrine of divine simplicity is supposed to be. And insofar as we do have an idea of this doctrine, it's difficult to see why anyone would accept it. The motivation is shrouded in obscurity. So I'm going to lay aside that complication here. And here's going to be the problem. All we need is one of the attributes of God, whatever they're supposed to be, however many such persons as God as there are supposed to be, even if there were to exist no such person of God, which is supposed to be impossible for Plantinga. Plantinga thinks God's a necessary being. All you need to be able to do is to predicatively express one of the attributes of God, however formal, modal, numinous, positive, whatever, that the Plantinga would ascribe to the God of theistic religion. And if there's anything which has one of the properties you might ascribe to God, then there's going to be something like God. So here's some examples. If God's supposed to have the property of being self-identical or being such that it is what it is for as long as it is what it is, then anything with the property of being self-identical would be like God in some respect. If God is supposed to have the property of necessary existence or being such that it exists in all possible worlds, then anything with the property of necessary existence would be like God in some respect. If God's supposed to have the property of numinosity or being such that our concepts don't apply to it, then any merely possible being such that our concepts don't apply to it would be like God in some respect. If God were supposed to have the property of omniscience, right, being such that Lady Wisdom, she knows all truths and believes no falsehoods, then all those things that know some truths and believe no falsehoods would be like God in some respect. Right? If suppose you're a rock, you don't have any beliefs, well then trivially you don't believe anything false, and in that respect a rock is like God. Maybe you're a skeptic, you don't believe that God exists, but you also don't believe that anything exists. Maybe you have no positive beliefs. If you have no positive beliefs, then you don't believe anything false, and even the skeptic would be like God in that respect, because God doesn't believe anything false. I mean, this is the idea. If you're like Jonathan Edwards and you think divine things are distinguished by their beauty, if God's supposed to be beautiful, such that those who see the stamp of glory, this glory in divine things, see God in them and see them to be divine because they see that in them, wherein the truest idea of divinity consists, then anything that would be so seen to be beautiful would appear to be just like God in that respect. Look, the cardinal difficulty is that everything is going to resemble God in some respect. And here we're coming into land. I've really only got a few more slides. Now, in his book, The Nature of Necessity, Plantinga says you've got to distinguish two kinds of sentences. One, when you talk about what there isn't, you don't want to posit that there is a thing which has the property of not existing. You want to deny that there is a thing which it has the property of existing. And in his next chapter, he says, a popular response is to deny that negative existentials are actually about the thing which doesn't exist, right? It would be silly to say that the claim that God doesn't exist is about a being called God, and that thing happens to have the property of not existing. People might think, well, I don't believe that Sherlock Holmes exists, right? But it's not a belief about this guy who lives at 221 Baker Street, and he happens to have this property of not existing. There's something absurd about that. And so many people, Plantinga says, will just deny that negative existential claims about what there isn't are about something that there is. So he says it's held that a proposition such as carnivorous cows don't exist is not about carnivorous cows. It's about the property, carnivorous bovinity, and saying nothing has that property. I hope you can see the problem here. The problem here is that, take any property that God's supposed to have in Plantinga's way of thinking. It's going to be absurd to say that nothing has that property. And this is going to turn his position, I'm going to say, absurd. And this is my final slide. When Plantinga's arguing, he says, in order to avoid automatically introducing into the argument assumptions about our mental life, suppose we conduct a thought experiment. Consider a hypothetical species that's a lot like us cognitively. Members of that species hold beliefs, they make inferences, they change beliefs and the like. And let us suppose naturalism holds for them. They exist in a world in which there is no such person as God or anything like God. And I'm going to say, you can't. That's absurd. If they have beliefs, then they're going to be like God in the respect of having beliefs. So we should just dismiss all of this as an impossible thought experiment. And that is what I'm saying is where the conflict really lies. I'm going to conclude with this. Plantinga says that naturalism tells us what reality is ultimately like, where we fit into the universe, how we're related to other creatures, how it happens that we came to be. Naturalism is therefore in competition with the great theistic religions. It's not obvious why he should think that, because he told us initially that naturalism didn't tell us anything about what reality is like. He just told us what it isn't like. He says, given that naturalism is at least a quasi-religion, there is at least a science-religion conflict, but it's between science and naturalism. That's where the conflict really lies. Now, in my view, naturalism might still be a quasi-religion. It might function as a religion, but not as Plantinga would have us believe. Thank you for listening.
Oh, Chris, thank you so much for your really interesting talk there. I think, you shared with us a lot of really interesting ideas around the meaning and definition of naturalism in the process of running through your argument there. And we've got a few questions come in on the Q&A. We have got, I guess, about 5 or 10 minutes for questions now. So if anyone listening has a question that you'd like to ask Chris, then please do type that into the Q&A field, and we will try and get through everything that you'd like to ask. So Chris, if I can, I'm just going to take the questions that we've got here. If I can take, first of all, it's a question. It says that if we define naturalism as a metaphysical view that claims about nature should be based in evidence from nature, do you think that there is a conflict between science and belief in, do you think there is a conflict between science and belief in, for example, bodily resurrection?
Thanks for the question. Naturalism is one word for many things, and you can take your pick. For the sake of my argument, I'm just looking at what Plantinga says. So what you said, naturalism, what else it could mean, that's not what Plantinga says it means. So just to bracket my answer to your question there, if we take naturalism to be the claim that we should base our beliefs on evidence from nature, then is that in conflict with belief in, say, the resurrection? Bas van Frassen says the problem here is going to be what is going to count as evidence. So if you think of the Protestant principle sola scriptura, right? Scripture alone is the only source of information about the world, or about God, or something like that. There was this Jesuit in the 17th century who said, well, which scriptures? And Bas van Frassen, who's a philosopher of science, says an exactly analogous move happens with the empiricist philosophers of science in the 20th century. A bunch of empiricists and evidentialists came along and says, sola evidentia, right? Evidence alone, or sola experientia. Experience alone is the source of information about the world. And Bas van Frassen is going to say, which experiences? Which evidence? What's going to count? And really, I'm very permissive on what counts. I don't have a priori judgment of which experiences are going to be kosher, right? So that's where I direct the questioner to think what's going to count here.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. So yeah, we have another question, which is a bit more of a sort of practical implications question from the talk. So, questioner noting lots of interesting ideas, but if you had to distill it down, can you suggest what would make, can you suggest one thing that would make a difference to the school curriculum of a year 10 student?
I don't know about year 10 students, but I would say this. Debates about naturalism generate an awful lot more heat than light. And I think part of the reason for that is there is no content to the claim of naturalism. If you define naturalism as the belief that there's nothing supernatural, well, then you're caught in this circle of what do you mean by nature natural? So I think Christians and religious people who think that somehow they need to defend the supernatural, and atheists and anti-theists who think that that naturalism is a kind of good thing for atheism, right? It tells us what there isn't, are both mistaken, and they should just chill out. And I think where the rubber hits the road in classrooms is I think this became an intensely political issue in the United States in the 1990s. So debates over intelligent design, for example, in the United States, suddenly made it a matter of intense legal and political controversy. What counts as natural science? And I think once you see that, you see the issue there was really a political and ideological problem about, I don't know, the Republican right or something like that. So if you had the view of like Charles Darwin, he said, by nature, I mean the laws God laid down to govern the universe. In his big book on natural selection, that's what he means by nature is just God's laws, right? So we should just help kids think nature's one of the things God does. You rethink these debates in hopefully more fruitful ways.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And yeah, we've got a couple more questions coming. First of all, Chris, do you think that Plantinga's tendency to think of naturalism the way he does is connected to an implicit account of nature? And if so, what do you think is Plantinga's understanding of nature? Nature obviously has multiple meanings since the dawn of history, and the questioner is interested in whether certain ways to approach nature leads to the kind of thinking about naturalism that you find in Plantinga.
In 1922, Roy Wood Sellers says this famous line, "We're all naturalists now." And even so, this common naturalism is of a very vague and general sort. It's an omission of a direction, not a well-formulated belief. And I just want to notice 1922 evolutionary naturalism. Now, the same year, a guy called J. Gresham Machen writes a piece called Liberalism or Christianity. And that's going to come out the next year, called Christianity and Liberalism. I think the culture war is where this comes from. So the same year, you've got the Protestant, whatever it is, the schism in the American universities over the fundamentals. And Machen writes this: "What at bottom, when the traditional phrases have all been stripped away, is the real meaning of the present revolt against what he called historic Christianity." How historic that was is another question. That revolt, manifold as are its manifestation, is a unitary phenomenon. It may be subsumed under the general head of naturalism. That is the denial of entrance to the creative power of God. That is in distinction from the ordinary course of nature, in connection with the origin of Christianity. The word naturalism is here used in a different sense from its philosophical meanings. I think he's absolutely right that the word naturalism is, in Machen's use, totally different from philosophical meanings. And I also think it was a mistake to basically have a culture war here. But I think that culture war between Machen's view and the Columbia naturalists, I think that's really where the energy for a lot of this debate came from. So just to give one example, in the southern states, Darwin's views were received as a northern plot propagated by Abraham Lincoln to unseat the South, right? Because social segregation was threatened by the doctrine of common descent. Now, to see why 1859, Darwin's origin, gets caught up into the Civil War in that way in 1861, and the Cornerstone speech and all of this stuff, all of that stuff about slavery in the Deep South, I think is underneath the culture wars that comes up in the 1900s with the fundamentals and all of this. So my own view is that the formation of the Society of Christian Philosophers that Alva Plantinga is a big part of in the 1980s is just drawing on this culture war. So I don't think it's coming from a view of nature. I think it's coming from a view of a political struggle. But that's my hunch. I haven't worked that out fully.
Great, thank you. And this may be the last question we've got time for looking at the clock, but we'll see how we go. So yeah, the question, it's another question that's been submitted on the online here, and the questioner says, it seems to me that much of your argument hinges on the idea that anything like God means anything that has any property in common with God. How would your argument change if Plantinga were to respond that by like God, he means something like similar in nature to God, and that is not sufficient to have a single property which God also has? In other words, if Plantinga's use of like is much stronger and intended to exclude beings such as angels and so on, and not simply anything with a property in common with God.
I'm just amazed and really honored by the depth of the question, because it really shows that the listener has understood what I'm trying to say here. Truth be told, I haven't worked out how to make this more precise and what Plantinga might say in response. There are different kinds of vagueness. I would say that there's a vagueness of deficiency of content, and there's a vagueness in predicate meaning. And I suspect that the problem would come in two ways. One, if you made F, in my view, stronger and said it's not just one of the properties of God, but some, some borderline number that is sufficient to generate the requisite resemblance. Well, first of all, the examples that Plantinga gives are going to be quite odd here. He's going to say Plato's theory of the good, Aristotle's physics, and I don't think there's going to be a principled way of drawing that line. And the second thing is, if it's in relation to God, that's the fundamental problem, right? If any of these properties are supposed to be defined by resemblance to God, well, what's God, right? And if you're constantly referring to this thing that you believe doesn't exist, it's going to be a very difficult thing to make sense of. So that's me thinking out loud. But honestly, thank you for the question. I would love to talk more about this to work out what he could say in reply.
I just say, I'm not a philosopher, but Chris, I think your talk has really stretched my thinking and imagination in a really positive way. So thank you so much for the insights that you've shared on this conundrum.